Amnesty International says there's a growing anti-human rights agenda worldwide. To counter it, has launched its first global emergency fundraising campaign. But how will rights defenders be protected? And are they losing the fight? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vanel. Amnesty International says the scale of attacks on rights defenders around the world is gravely concerning. The group has launched its first global emergency fundraising appeal to help protect them. It's now calling on individuals and large donors to expand their support. Amnesty says the aim is to counter what it calls a growing anti-human rights agenda. The watchdog accuses so-called strongman leaders of increasingly spreading division, fear and silencing critical voices. Activists, lawyers, journalists and those working with NGOs have faced prosecution, harassment and even torture. The rights group says the money raised will go to relocating those in danger and providing them with legal and medical aid, among other costs. Well, let's take a look at a few governments cited by the group. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte signed an anti-terrorism act into law last year, granting his government unchecked powers to prosecute activists. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro has imposed multiple policies that rights groups say threaten the environment and limit women's rights. Turkey's parliament has rushed through a new law that makes it difficult for civil society organisations to raise money, and Turkey has been targeting dissident voices. And many countries have used the global pandemic to adopt new laws that restrict press freedom. In Hungary, the criminal code was amended, threatening journalists with 5 years in prison for spreading what officials consider false information. Well, here are some of the world's biggest rights groups. Amnesty International was founded in 1961 by a British lawyer who wanted to obtain amnesty for political prisoners around the world. It has since grown into a global movement of more than 10 million supporters. Human Rights Watch was established in 1978 to investigate rights abuses in countries that signed the Helsinki Declaration. It now operates on 5 continents. And Civil Rights Defenders was created in 1982 in Sweden with a mission to empower rights activists who are at risk. The group now operates in some of the world's most repressive regions. Well, it's time now to bring in our guests. In London, we have Rajat Khosla, Senior Director for Research, Advocacy and Policy at Amnesty International. In Konstanz, Germany, Judith Bayer, Professor of Social and Political Anthropology at the University of Konstanz. And also in London, Toby Cadman, an international human rights lawyer. Very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. I'd like to begin with you, Rajat Khosla. Tell me about this growing backlash against those working to defend human rights, against amnesty workers rather. I mean, surely this is nothing new.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kim, and a great pleasure to be with you and with colleagues for this discussion. As you rightly said in your introduction, what we are facing is an unprecedented situation. And the situation is not unprecedented because we have not confronted these challenges before. But it is unprecedented because of the sheer scale and brazenness with which the crackdown against civic space and the human rights agenda is being implemented by the governments around the world. If we look closely, and you cited some of the specific instances from governments and the strongman leadership that is being manifested, we have a few clear trends that are starting to emerge. Firstly, there's a pattern of threats, intimidation, and harassment that is visible in relation to the work on human rights around the world. It is not only in terms of what we do today, but we are facing reprisal because we speak out and we stand for human rights. The attacks that we are facing are for both in terms of the issues that we work in, but also the kind of work that we do. Media workers, journalists, advocates, activists are being reprimanded for the work that they do. Only recently in India, 8 journalists have been booked for covering farmers' protests that have been going on. I have to also point out that this is not sudden, but it is systemic and has been building up over a period of time. Importantly, also, what we are witnessing is not only just the physical elements of threat, intimidations, and violence that we are facing, but also within the digital space as well, where smear campaigns are being launched against human rights defenders around the world.
I'm going to
What
get
we are
on to.
therefore
I want to get on to the issue of how the digital sphere has impacted the work of human rights activists, workers, a little later in the program. For now, I'd like to come to you, Judith Bayer, if I may. What's your take? Are things actually getting worse for human rights defenders? And what countries, in your experience, are the worst offenders?
Yeah, I would definitely have to agree with you and the colleague who just spoke. I'm working personally in authoritarian states in Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia and in Myanmar in Southeast Asia. Both have a notorious history of human rights abuse. We've just witnessed this week a coup in Myanmar. The military has taken over, and while we're speaking, I know of human rights defenders who have gone into hiding because they're fearing arrest. And so definitely, yes, the situation is getting worse, is getting more difficult for people on the ground, but also for outsiders like me who are trying to work in the interspace between activism and scholarly work. And it's a very tough situation, yes.
Toby Cadman, why do you think we're seeing this rise in the targeting of human rights defenders?
Thank you. And just to reinforce what two other guests have said, I think it's quite right that whilst this is not new, it is so much worse, more concentrated than I think we've ever experienced before. And so, and I think there are, of course, a number of reasons for that. I think the pandemic has contributed. The pandemic is used as a way to censor and to curb human rights and fundamental freedoms. And you know, we have situations in countries like Egypt, Bangladesh, the Gulf states, where free speech is obviously not permissible in any shape or form, and any criticism is targeted. And so you have laws being enacted in those states to target human rights defenders, investigative journalists, and any form of criticism. And I think a lot of it comes from the insecurity that autocracies and dictatorships have. And so, you know, whilst they have been able to use the courts as a tool to repress any form of opposition to their rule, I think we're seeing new ways to do that, and human rights defenders being targeted in particular. I mean, myself, I've been detained in Bangladesh. I've been detained in Israel for doing human rights work. So you know that has been increasing over time, and I think the emergence of social media and what I think we call the weaponization of misinformation has been used as a way to discredit and target human rights groups in particular. So I think that there are numerous reasons for it, but I think it's it's sort of the entrenchment of all autocratic policies that has been used to target human rights defenders, whether it's Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, or whether it's individual human rights advocates.
Rachad Kosler, how has the rise of, in your opinion, how has the rise of populism contributed to the rise in attacks on human rights defenders?
I think it has had an immense contribution in terms of the overall approach that these populist leaders have tended to have on the work on human rights. And in their view, therefore, any form of dissent needs to be muzzled and silenced. And the tactics that have been, therefore, appointed by leaders from Modi to Duterte to former US President Trump speak to this effect. And what it has ended up doing is in terms of using demagoguery as the populist rhetoric and in terms of feeding into the fear of people, and while abandoning the human rights protection and guarantees. And at the end, what you are seeing is a growing trend, as what previous speaker also pointed out to, is criminalization of civic space. In India, for instance, recently, we have just seen cases using criminal law provisions of sedition, of anti-terror legislation in other countries that have been used against human rights defenders. And this is increasingly worry in terms of how these populist governments are looking at those activists working on the ground and protesting for justice.
Judith Meyer, I was interested to hear from you that human rights can only be claimed if a person has a nationality or is recognized as being stateless by a state. So that must mean that a lot of people have no recourse should their human rights be abused.
Yeah, this is unfortunately correct for all those people who are de facto stateless. There's a differentiation being made between de jure stateless people and de facto stateless people. If a state officially recognizes you as a stateless person, you do have human rights and access to all kinds of other rights, and you are protected in this sense. But the problem is that the majority of stateless people, and we're talking about a number of 10 million to 15 million people at the moment, are de facto stateless. So they do not have access to human rights. They don't have, as Hannah Arendt famously pointed out, even the right to have rights. And this goes, for example, for the big group of the Muslim Rohingya who have been shuffled between Bangladesh and Myanmar for the last decades. Most of them are de facto stateless, and this is a huge problem, I think, that needs more attention internationally also, because when we speak of human rights, we assume that every person has them, but there is this large group of stateless people who do not, and we need to take care of these people as well.
Toby Cadman, give us your take on the overall legal landscape in terms of the defence of human rights. And are these international treaties working?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest problems, and it's always a question of enforceability and effective enforceability. We have a number of different mechanisms that we can turn to, and it's all well and good having the treaties and also the reporting mechanisms, but if there is no effective enforceability, and if states are at liberty to just ignore that process, then whatever process you have in place is going to provide no remedy to the violation. So you have the situation where you have states like Saudi Arabia, as an example, sitting on human rights panels at the UN Human Rights Council. You have the situation with the UN Security Council, where one or more of the 5 permanent members has the ability to veto a referral to the International Criminal Court, for example, and in a situation in which one of those 5 permanent members may have been actively involved in the commission of international crimes. So the difficulty that you have is that there is no enforceability mechanism. One of the issues that was raised recently by UN Special Rapporteur Agnes Kalamar, when we were looking at the brutal execution of Jamal Khashoggi, was that there is no standing mechanism to deal with this particular type of situation, particularly as far as journalists and human rights defenders are concerned. So I think a lot of the frustration comes from, certainly when I'm approached as a human rights lawyer to act for a victim, what can you do to bring about any resolution to my particular problem? And that is always the biggest frustration. You have the International Criminal Court, but it is limited in its jurisdiction. You have the human rights monitoring bodies that on the UN level that is dealt with by state cooperation. If there is no state cooperation, there is no effective remedy.
Wow, the picture you're painting is one, the entire system seems very ineffective. I want to come back to Rajat Khosla. What are the most used tactics now to suppress human rights defenders, and how has that changed over time? Amnesty has been around since 1961, so how have those tactics changed over time?
Thanks, Kim. And I think, unfortunately, the picture is indeed very bleak when we look at the kind of tactics that are being used. And unfortunately, these are the tactics that are drawing upon the classic playbook of human rights violators around the world. What we are looking at tactics, as for instance, them freezing the bank accounts and making operations of human rights organizations on the ground. We at Amnesty in India were at the front line of this attack and continue to be unable to operate in the country because of a freezing of our assets within the country context. The other tactic that is being used is that of smear campaigns against human rights defenders and those who work in this regard. If you look at what has happened in Hungary, for instance, the parliament passing a legislation in 2018 which criminalizes anybody providing support to asylum seekers, and an Amnesty, along with several other organizations, had their membership and other details being leaked by actors supporting the government. Then, if that isn't enough, what they also use is violence against us. We have had in Venezuela, one of our former chair members of Amnesty in Venezuela actually attacked and suffered a gunshot injury about 100 meters away from the office. And then there are, of course, constant threats and intimidations and harassment, which we are facing around the world, from Nigeria to Hong Kong to several other locations as well. So unfortunate picture there is in terms of classic human rights violators playbooks being used against those defending human rights.
Judith Beyer, if we are all agreeing then that human rights globally seem to be under attack, perhaps going backwards, has the human rights defence movement, civil society groups like Amnesty International, have they in some way failed? Does the whole idea of naming and shaming, that strategy, does that need to be thought about again?
I'm not sure whether I, as a scholar, am the right person to ask this question, because I do think that we need to acknowledge it's an incredibly hard and very dangerous type of work that these people are doing, and they're brave in doing so. And I think what has failed is the very system of how states are operating. We could also criticize the way the UN is operating. For example, in Myanmar right now, there is a statement from the UN Security Council. But if you look at the language, then it's again phrased in terms of grave concern, for example. So it's very, very timid and very careful. And we all know that this is how the UN can operate, but the abuses are really extreme, as my colleague just said, and I can observe the same thing happening in Kyrgyzstan and Myanmar, for example, in Bangladesh.
Okay.
So
before we move away from the question, I understand that if you feel like it's not in your remit, I want to put the same question to Toby Cadman. Before I come back to you, Rajat Khosla, for your response, Toby, are rights groups, human rights defenders, failing to come up with revolutionary alternatives to what they're doing, which seems to not be working?
No. Put very simply, no. I think we would be in a substantially worse position was it not for groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch doing the incredibly important work that they're doing. But we also have to recognise the limitations on what they can achieve. I think that certainly both Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, as the two leading organisations in this field, have adapted to the changing environment, do approach things in a very different way now than they did 10 years ago, and have had to do that because of the environment in which we're forced to work. An organisation such as the one I'm at Guernica, I mean, we rely a huge amount on the reports that Amnesty and Human Rights Watch prepares and presents publicly. You know, if we're looking at defending an individual in the national courts in the United Kingdom, we will have to use the reports of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch because they're the only authoritative reports on particular thematic and geographical issues. So no, the failure is not from them. The failure is from states, and the failure is from the United Nations in not producing an effective mechanism to deal with it.
Rajat Khosla, I'd like to come back to you. Nobody is going to argue the fact that human rights abuses are abhorrent, that people who defend human rights are doing very good work, that shining a light on this is crucial. Is there room for improvement in the way Amnesty International works, say with financial management? I mean, you're having to put a call out for funds because you desperately need them to continue your work.
Thank you, Kim. That's I cannot say it better than my two previous colleagues who have spoken in this regard. There are a couple of things which are important to unpack. The first is, which was point very eloquently made by Toby just now, is in relationship to the mechanisms that we have at our disposal, and are they fit for purpose? Unfortunately, the answer is that they are not fit for purpose, and we do need to look deeper and harder in terms of addressing the gaps that we have, because at the end of the day, what we are unable to do is provide effective remedies and justice to those facing human rights violations. We also need to address the role that member states of these mechanisms and institutions are playing in relation to the abandonment of their responsibilities in this regard, and often using mechanisms such as Security Council or the Human Rights Council as fig leaves that they hide behind, and not being fair in their engagement of these mechanisms. The point about can we do better? Of course we can do better. We are constantly evolving and learning from the lessons of the past and adopting to new techniques that we are doing. We today have got mechanisms and partnerships through which we are working in terms of looking at the work, for instance, that we are doing in terms of digital surveillance, etc., and addressing the new forms of attacks and intimidations that are happening within the space. We are constantly evolving in terms of addressing issues that we haven't been confronted with, whether it is within the physical space or within the digital space. So yes, of course, there is always a room for improvement, but where we do need some serious improvement is in terms of the conduct of these member states, and there is a complete abandonment of leadership on their regard. And I have to cite an anecdote. What we used to actually use within the human rights work is that of naming and shaming that you also referred to, and the whole idea behind the naming and shaming tactic was that if you name them, they might be ashamed to actually do some corrective action. But today we are looking at leadership that is shameless and that does not actually react to any kind of criticism. So we are looking very deep in terms of how do we address these unprecedented nature of attacks that we are facing, which have gotten very brazen, and people are paying with their lives, unfortunately.
Judith Bayer, we're running towards the end of the program. I want to ask you, because we talked about it a little earlier, just touched on it. How do you see the advances in the digital space online, how that has impacted the work of human rights defenders?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important. We're witnessing it right now in Myanmar, where the revolution or the resistance movement is happening online for two reasons. One is because of the pandemic, and two, because people are afraid to go outside. So they're organizing online. It was usually done only through Facebook. Facebook has a very important role in Myanmar. And then Facebook was shut down yesterday. So everyone was basically moving to Twitter, installing VPN servers to relocate outside of the country to then be able to access Facebook again. All of the organization of resistance is happening online, and it's incredibly important. And for us as scholars also, as activists, as human rights defenders, as lawyers, we need to be available online as well in order to remain in touch with the people. So it's an incredibly important momentum in human rights defense, I would say.
Toby Cadman, just very quickly, what is your hope for the coming year in terms of human rights? What are the big issues that you think the world is facing and should be listening to?
One of the issues that we're doing a lot of work on at the moment, and we want to get the international community to take more note of, is the, as I mentioned earlier, the weaponization of misinformation. I think it's a very poisonous and dangerous innovation that we've seen, where effectively social media makes everyone a journalist, and everything they say has the appearance of being the truth. And that has very dangerous consequences in situations like Syria, for example. The other thing, I think, which is incredibly important, that we're not going to change the UN Security Council overnight, and we're not going to change the UN into being a more enforceable process. And I appreciate the UN is many different forms; it's not just one thing. But I think that's something that has to be looked at in the long term. And then the final thing, I think, is that there has to be greater attention to the protection of human rights defenders and whistleblowers. I think what we're seeing is systems like Interpol being abused for...
My apologies.
purpose of targeting.
We have to leave it there for time. We have run out of time for the programme. Thank you very much to all of our guests, Rajat Khosla, Judith Bayer and Toby Cadman. Thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Kim Vanel, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye-bye for now.